Okay, everybody. So we're getting started, and we're moving now on to our third speaker, a man who, of course, needs no introduction. Alan, have you been to the forum? How many times? Is this your third or fourth time?
Fifth.
Okay, fifth time, and you delivered one of your papers with a broken leg by proxy, by Skype. Was it by Skype? Yeah. No, it was by proxy, wasn't it?
It was by proxy, and then
you took questions afterwards.
Yeah, we did our best.
I think I'm particularly grateful to Alan because he does so much work to recruit and to bring and to organise the students, and that makes this event so much more exciting than it would be otherwise. He is, of course, Professor at the University of Victoria and a world authority on anarchism and art, and today he is going to talk about the graphic artist Kevin Pyle, whose work has proved hugely influential, I think, in North America and beyond. So, Alan, please.
Yeah, I should say that it's no problem recruiting students to come up to the forum. They're clamoring, and our department is so grateful for this relationship which Betty and Jeffrey forged between our two institutions, and not only with the art history department, but the other departments in the Faculty of Fine Arts, and we're thrilled with what's unfolding here. And you're such a tag team. You got to continue. Okay, so today's forum, what have we been looking at? We've been looking at art's potential to communicate moral values. And to my mind, this presupposes a deep social responsibility on the part of the artist. And I think that came through with some of the other talks yesterday, that sense of artistic agency, but also social responsibility. What do you do with the artwork? How do you make it alive and enter into the world to serve a transformative purpose, which is positive? So today I'm going to be looking at this issue of morality and social agency in the work of graphic artist Kevin Pyle. Over the last 2 decades, he's produced numerous graphic stories and also investigative exposés for activist and mainstream publishers. And he has a world in mainstream publishing where he reaches tens of thousands of people of many generations, and also a world of activist publishing, which has been equally impactful in a different way. So what's my concern? My concern is with how he infuses his work with empathy and love in a bid to disrupt dehumanizing forces, sort of cantilevering on nationalism and authoritarianism. So here's Kevin with the 3 publications I'm going to be talking about today. And he's interested in pedagogy. He has a child of his own. We've had conversations about the challenges and joys of raising children. And he conceives of learning as a key element in his art. I'm interested in how his art simultaneously models alternatives to the social structures that he critiques. So there's this interesting kind of duality to his work that unfolds in tandem and in interrelationship. What I'm going to demonstrate is his ultimate purpose, which is to remind us of anarchism's foundational conviction that freedom is interrelated with our capacity to create and recreate the social order, empowering ourselves while disempowering authoritarianism through our enacting of our being in the world. So in 2001, Pyle published this book, Lab USA, with an anarchist publisher in New York called Autonomedia. And what it is, it's an illustrated documentary of biological and psychological experiments conducted by government, corporate, and military agencies on civilians, soldiers, and prisoners. And Kevin told me that he called it Illuminated to signal the fact that he did intensive research going through declassified governmental documents to illuminate these activities, to expose them and bring them to the light of day. So the book was actually an outgrowth of his involvement in a publication called World War III, which is an illustrated comic, it's a comic book project. World War III was founded in the 1980s by participants in New York City's squatter movement. The publication is run on a collective basis, and people who are part of World War III, it's a loose-based artist collective, and they rotate the editorship of each issue. And so someone puts their hands up and says, I'm concerned with this issue, and then they edit that issue. And then contact artists in the collective and others to contribute to the issue. It's one of North America's longest-standing running anarchist projects, going since the 1980s. I think it's a great example of how to reach a wide audience through a popular medium, comics. Right? Everyone reads those, or many do. I did. So Lab USA includes material that appeared in an issue that Kevin Pyle edited, focusing on prisons. And here I'm showing you the cover of that issue. When Kevin was working on this issue, he contacted Jim Campbell, the publisher of Prison News Service. This is a Canadian-based anarchist journal which was created by an anarchist collective based in Toronto, and they'd send this to prisoners, and they get contributions from prisoners. It was an avenue for prisoners to articulate what was going on in their lives, the injustices that they're dealing with, and so forth. It's also fascinating to flip through because it's filled with artwork by prisoners, many of them Indigenous, actually. But that's another story. Anyway, Kevin's purpose with contacting Jim Campbell, the editor of Prison News Service, was to get in contact with prisoners, because he wanted to tell their stories in the special issue of World War III that he was editing. So Jim Campbell, in turn, put Kevin Pyle in touch with a network of these prisoners with a radical consciousness across the U.S., and then they wrote first-hand accounts of what they were experiencing in prison. How powerful is that? Here I'm showing you a note that Jim sent. I knew Jim Campbell, actually, before he unfortunately passed on. A note that Jim sent to Kevin Pyle talking about how much he appreciated what he'd done and how impressed he was with this publication. Anyway, Lab USA includes a story originally published in this issue of World War III entitled On the Road. And On the Road pairs illustrations of desolate highway landscapes with accounts of an informal, I'm going to call it torture technique, known as diesel therapy in the prison lingo. Give you a chance to take a look at these illustrations. These are by Kevin. So what is diesel therapy? Prisoners who are deemed to be problematic are thrown into solitary confinement for 3 months. Then they're put on a bus. They're frequently chained onto the bus in the seats and subject to strip searches. They receive 1 hot meal a day, and they're on this bus in transit for 3-6 months, back and forth. While they're on the road, of course, they're cut off from any access to family, friends. Their personal possessions are no longer with them. And when they arrive in their new destination, another prison, finally they're confined to solitary for 3 more months. So, what is the perspective that Kevin Pyle gives us? He gives us the perspective of the prisoners. And he combines this perspective with dispassionate descriptions of the procedure, kind of a clinical description of the procedure. In his illustrations for diesel therapy, the descriptions eventually merge with snippets from the prisoners themselves who experienced this, writing to Kevin Pyle and describing it. one of my favorite quotes from one of these prisoners is, "One of the few advantages is getting to see some scenery." So that's one of the stories in Lab USA. Another one related to prisons is the phenomenon of maximum security control units. I don't know how many people are familiar with this style of incarceration, which sadly is bled into the Canadian prison system as well. Anyway, these maximum security control units permeate the U.S. prison system. And in his book, Pyle presents the prisoner's point of view, again, taking us into the subjective experience of the prisoner, right? And the point of view unfolds in silence as a visual experience. So he's using the impactful power of the graphic illustration to take us inside the prison, take us into the control unit, take us into the body and the visceral experience of the prisoner. So we got the unfolding of this experience as a visual experience amidst the voices of the unit's designers, and also top-down surveillance of a prisoner in an isolation cell trying to cope with the situation. And as we scan the imagery, information builds, as you're flipping through the book, from the initial proposal by a psychologist to institute these units to the prison bureaucracy's embrace of the idea. What a great idea. And off it went. So Pyle combines a statement revealing the underlying political purpose of these control units. Quote, and this is the voice of the bureaucrats here, to control revolutionary attitudes within the prison system and society at large. End of quote. With clinical reports on the types of psychosis that these units induce. So, people who are studying the condition of the prisoners in these units note that they hear voices. They suffer panic attacks. They grow acutely sensitive to stimuli. They also cut and mutilate themselves. So he fills the pages with the voices of these prisoners. And the voices are pressing in on an individual who, as you can see, comes to dominate the cell. It really communicates a sense of, your bodily confinement in a closed space, which is extremely small, right? And you're in there 24/7. This is a device that intensifies our perception of confined isolation and what that experience would be like. The illustrative technique enacts a reversal of perspective in which we have the dispassionate voices of the state and medical authorities commingling with those they repress. And the voices of the repressed gain agency. The systemic nature of the horrific practices being documented resides in the pretense to objectivity, which is a dehumanizing stance, right, towards another human being. Towards the people who are subjected to the whims of the actors. And what shields those actors? Their dispassionate, bureaucratic dehumanization of themselves as they do this to people. Revealing the hidden structures that make such abuse possible, Lab USA educates and radicalizes its readers by going to the root of the problem. It's a relationship of authoritarianism and dehumanization that makes this systemic bureaucratic system possible. More recently, Kevin's collaborated with a prison justice and advocacy organization that's based in Washington, D.C., to produce an easy-to-read comic book documenting the impact of the U.S. prison industrial complex, and that was my reading. I hope a few of you had a chance to look at it. And as you can see, the comic book is called Prison Town. What's the purpose here? It's to alert people about the devastating consequences of a building boom in prisons, which grips the United States and has actually become a huge problem economically for various states within the U.S. During the 1980s, prisons began to be marketed as job creators to small towns that were being hit by deindustrialization and poverty. And this marketing of a prison as a job creator proved to be a very seductive technique, and people have fallen all too easily into welcoming the prison into their home, so to speak, into their community. So what Kevin does is he gives us the story of one town's descent, I'll use that term, into a prison town. And this process is broken up in the middle by this diagram, which takes up 2 pages of the comic, where we see how public funding underwriting the prisons is systematically enriching investors and politicians while the social costs escalate. So there's a narrative here which is socioeconomic, which has to do with, and political as well, which has to do with how the prisons serve certain economic interests in society and enrich some while, in effect, bringing arguably impoverishment to other communities. Because documenting the real cost of prisons, doesn't just end with the damage done to the communities that are lured into building them, where your father or your mother is now going off to participate in all that goes on in a prison, then coming home. How do they behave when they get home? But this criminalization process that is integral to the prison process is targeting impoverished people in the United States, predominantly African Americans, also people of, Latinos as they're called. So the prison expansion is complemented by another expansion of surveillance and policing, millions and millions of dollars being spent on targeting the inhabitants of rundown inner cities for imprisonment. You got to feed the monkeys, so to speak. So Pyle narrates how law enforcement racism, I'll call it that, is ripping the poor from their communities and then dumping them into these prisons, which are far on the hinterland, so they are simultaneously separated from their families and their loved ones. And then he closes with examples of the alternative, a few instances where communities have channeled public funds into trying to, trying to uplift the social situation or improve the social situation of people in these impoverished districts in the cities through investing in schools, libraries, social programs, things that keep people from being criminalized in the first place. Why don't we invest in that? Over 41,000 copies of this comic have been printed. Thousands have been sent to incarcerated prisoners, also their families, also community activists across the United States. What is Kevin Pyle doing? He's contributing to and grounding his work in lived experience. He's using his art to build a movement against the prison industrial complex. And he's also giving us sequential narratives of empathy with those subject to repressive economic and governmental forces across social and racial divides that normally keep people's consciousness of what's going on in one community and another community separated. Prison Town's immediate objective is to inspire people to organize and fight back against this process and make them consciousness of what's going on with the expansion of prisons. But it also calls larger issues into question. The center spread I showed you showcases a dysfunctional system, a corrupted system, the system of representational democracy in the United States, and its ability to sustain and nurture the prison industrial complex, and that's a problem in and of itself. Now, another issue that Kevin has addressed is the politics of memory. And the politics of memory in the United States is a very powerful one. There's a very powerful narrative about the United States and its conception of what it means to be American. And this is another issue that Kevin Pyle has mobilized his talents around. Reflecting on a war that's routinely promoted in the United States as a defense of freedom, I'm talking about the Second World War, Kevin Pyle's disrupted this narrative by recalling an injustice that pivoted on a process of othering those whom the United States government during the war banished from American status. After the U.S. entered the war, over 110,000 people of Japanese heritage were declared enemy aliens. They were instructed, and this of course happened in Canada as well, they were instructed to take what you can carry and given 24 hours to sell what they could and gather their belongings. Then they were shipped to internment camps. Kevin Pyle's produced a wonderful graphic novel called Take What You Can Carry, published by a mainstream publisher, which weaves together the lives of two boys, one who lives through the internment camp experience, and the other who grows up in a Chicago suburb in the late 1970s. The story of the Japanese-American boy in the internment camp, it unfolds without words in brown monochrome. What a device for casting our imagination back before an experience within our lifetime for many readers. The counterpart's tale, The Chicago Boy, in the 1970s, that tale is depicted in washed-out blue, and it follows the standard illustrated story format with these little voice bubbles and so forth. So we have these two stories, and he weaves them together really seamlessly. Their lives converge at the intersection of anti-authoritarianism and secrets revealed, in both instances mediated by mutual compassion and also a breakdown of the othering process of treating someone in a dehumanized way. So, the narrative of the Chicago boy, a known delinquent, whose adventures come to an end after he's caught stealing from a grocery store. And the owner of the grocery store is the Japanese boy once in the internment camp, now grown up. He decides not to press charges on the condition that this boy that's been stealing from his store work for him to compensate for his actions. Now, what's he pondering when he's thinking about, am I going to send this little kid to a juvenile delinquent center and subject him to all that? He's thinking about his own time in the internment camp, when he engaged in his own petty theft, stealing boards to take to an artisan who was using them to create animal carvings in the camp. So an artisan in the Japanese community incarcerated who was carving these little wooden toys for the kids, and also teaching some of them to carve as well. So he makes the decision not to send the kid to the camp or to the prison. You're going to work for me. And while he's supervising this delinquent, he discovers the boy's compassion for the plight of a fellow thief who got away because the boy was stealing from his store with another kid. The boy refused to give his friend's name up to the police or the shop owner because the boy knew that his friend was being battered by his father. And you can read the narrative here. So when he learns what's going on in this other child's life, he's moved. He has his own epiphany, his own sense of empathy with the child, and he gives the boy one of the birds that he himself carved when he was in the internment camp, and then he tells him the story of when I was a child, when I was stealing, what happened to me. A story that has a secret component to it. At the camp, the military police periodically seized personal items from people incarcerated in the camp, which they stored in a shed outside the perimeter. And during one such instance, they take the carver's tools, and the boy who's been learning how to carve from the carver and wants to, help the carver, is determined to recover them. So what he does is he sneaks out from the camp at night and breaks into the shed. But he's caught by a military policeman because, of course, the camp is constantly controlled. Confronted by this terrified teenager trying to recover tools for carving birds, the soldier has an epiphany. Who's the real thief? The incarcerated child or the state that's othered the child, stolen him from his home, taken his property, etc. The soldier reflects on the consequences of what he's about to do, which is break the regulations, break the enforced laws of the camp. He lets the boy go, and he asks him to keep his dereliction of duty a secret, which the boy does. Don't tell. This compassionate unraveling of authority plays out in the present as well in the story. So we're back in Chicago. We're with the boy who's returning home with his father, and the boy learns that the owner saved him from the punitive system of American law enforcement by refusing to press charges, choosing instead to let the boy work with him so the boy could have a chance to develop a deeper understanding of what he'd done, the consequences, and build remorse for his actions. And Kevin ends his novel with a metaphor of freedom. We have the carved birds taking flight as the internment camps are closed and Japanese Americans are released. So what's going on here? Take What You Can Carry appeals to a willingness to ignore, to break, to circumnavigate laws that get in the way of what? That get in the way of mutual understanding, of the righting of injustices. It presents anti-authoritarianism also as a learning process which transforms social interrelationships on this micro level and on this macro level. This reminds me of anarchist educational theorist Layla Abdel Rahim's observations concerning the need to infuse learning with what she calls the ontological urge towards freedom. What are we as human beings on this planet? We're part of a complex ecology of diversification that's integral to the very life energy of the planet that we're part of. Society should be nurturing this impetus towards freedom within us, not denying it or repressing it. In Layla's words, the pedagogical path to shedding authoritarianism is, quote, the ability to imagine what others live and feel and being capable of connecting this information with one's own life. Empathy is the key to intelligence, and together with imagination, interconnectedness, cooperation, and respect for the choices of others, constitutes the exigent components of a sustainable culture. Such values, of course, are arguably antithetical to state-based conceptions of citizenship, obedience, and acquiescence to higher authorities, which can erect dehumanizing barriers between people. And this is Kevin Pyle's point. Perhaps the most subversive way to assert compassion towards others is to reject such identities that divide us. We can strike out in a different direction. We can be freed to imagine different paradigms for organizing society, ones in which authoritarianism never gains power in the first place. Thanks.